Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley. We're going to be talking about turning struggles into strength, something that Amanda knows a lot about. She is a nationally certified counselor with over 10 years of clinical experience working with the military community. She is also a military widow, so she has not only professional experience, but lived experience and personal experience, and a Gold Star spouse. Amanda specializes in working with service members, spouses, veterans, and their families. Welcome to our podcast, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so great to have you on the show today. I wanted to ask you, your husband passed away of cancer 10 years ago, right?
You did, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, before he died, were you involved in counseling?
Not at all. We're recently married, had moved. He was getting stationed in New Mexico and was working in marketing and advertising at the time. And due to, we had just had a baby, and my son Noah was 3 months old when my husband John got diagnosed with a brain tumor. And so that kind of spun life on its head. And so forced me to unfortunately have to quit my job at that time to just be a full-time caregiver for my son and my husband. As we kind of went through the treatment options, the Air Force was amazing enough to let us move back to my hometown in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to have some family support for him to do some of his treatments while he was going through his brain cancer journey. But yeah, ended up being a full-time caregiver. And then, of course, after his passing and battling for 18 months, just wanted to turn that pain into purpose. Selfishly, probably just wanted to heal. But in hindsight, my dad's a pastor, my mom was a teacher. And so the counseling profession was a good fit for me.
I love the idea of making your pain into the purpose. And I always say, make your mess your mission.
Went to grad school while being kind of a single parent and kind of in the early trenches in grief. So kind of a wounded healer, trying to heal myself, also trying to figure out my path forward. And luckily, counseling gave me meaning and purpose. It gave me a reason to say my husband's name and to help other widows and young military families, unfortunately, that might be going through the same experiences that I had.
Well, I know you and Heidi work with military families who've had a loss. I wondered is it different being in the military and having a loss, do you think, than for others?
I think so. We were blessed to have an incredible military community surround us during that time. And he was on hospice care for about 8 months before he passed in our home on base. And it was great to have all of our military friends and family support us during that time. And I can't imagine not having that. We did move pretty shortly after he passed. So that was a pretty big change from going to a lot of people knowing your story to a town where nobody knew who you were. And I also recently lost my mom, so the experience was very different than losing my husband in the military.
Well, I think that I'm so sorry about the death of your mom, Amanda. And I think that you're making a really important point about the military, which I have a son that was in the military. He's a veteran now, but I've never lived on a base or anything. And what I've learned from you and everybody at TAPS is that, Heidi, not only do we have a death of someone, but we lose our entire community. We have to move if we're on base. Like everybody's like all of a sudden not in our lives anymore. And like you said, you moved home to Baton Rouge and left an entire community.
Yeah, it was a big transition for me and my son. And not only are you dealing with a huge loss of your spouse, but it's so many different losses all at once. And, they always say, don't do anything in the first year. Well, for us, death demanded decisions. And you're not in the right state of mind. I had a 2-year-old baby and I was trying to figure out, where do I go? What do I do? And the best option was to go to my other family, which is, my parents and back home. And ultimately, we ended up moving to Niceville, Florida, which where my practice is, another military community that we can still kind of be a part of, but it's still kind of a little different.
Mhm. You know, love what you're saying right now because I've been a therapist for 40 years and really I had dealt with a lot of widows. And one of the things the standard thing is don't do anything for a year. Well, then I was widowed 4 years ago and I realized you do what you do to survive and keep yourself going. And the idea that don't do anything for a year is really, I did a lot of things, sold a house,
Yeah.
you know, did different things. So you have to do what you have to do to survive, don't you?
It's not realistic oftentimes to not
Right.
make any changes in the first 12 months.
The reality is you are going to make mistakes and it's okay. You do what you do and then you change it and do something else. So, it's not
Well, and
gonna be set in stone.
my mom and you have both lost their spouses, and I know that that's also a big identity loss.
Mhm.
Right.
Like, who am I
Yeah,
now that I'm not a wife to somebody?
especially when you had a military husband also, you're part of the military in a way. And
Mhm.
that is kind of not there anymore. And, my husband was a businessman and, you lose that community. So it's interesting, but you're a young widow, which is a
Mhm.
lot different than being my age and having my husband pass away. There are a lot of challenges for you, right?
Yeah, I was widowed when I was 30 and I had a 2-year-old baby at the time. And yeah, I thought my husband and I were going to be married till we were 90 years old and wearing matching Hawaiian shirts and, you know, like my parents had been married almost 50 years and that was suddenly gone. Like you said, so many losses and a lot of judgment for someone that's young in 30s of trying to get over it to move on, but also personally having to deal with losing the military. I wasn't in, and I didn't really know much about being a Gold Star widow. I always joke and say I got a death binder when my husband died of all the military things. And I was too in shock and distraught to really understand the resources available to me. Thankfully, God put military widows and people that I've met, like Dr. Heidi, in my life to connect me with TAPS and different organizations, Tunnel to Towers as well, that provide amazing things for Gold Star widows. I can't imagine. And I counsel lots of widows who don't have that military support or resources, which is difficult.
And what do you suggest to them?
Definitely find a great counselor. And I'm also part of a Christian organization called Never Alone Widows, and they do some great work, not only with Gary Sinise and kind of the military widows as well. They offer retreats and conferences, but it's been a great organization as well for those widows who have lost someone any age or any stage to be connected to other women because that's what it's about. As you're walking this new journey, you've lost a community. It's trying to find this new one. And we're out there. I always tell people like I'm a widow, they're out there somewhere, but trying to find those connections.
I'm aware of Soaring Spirits Foundation, Michelle Neff Hernandez, but I hadn't heard of Never Alone Widows, that Christian organization. That's good to know about. Now, I know that one of the things that some of our audience have had that a lot of military people have had is trauma. And I
Mhm.
wondered if you could talk about that because I know you've trained in trauma therapy. Can you give us some thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my therapist has saved my life more than one time just due to the physical effects of trauma. And trauma doesn't necessarily have to be kind of that main loss. It's a lot of these different losses, of my identity as a wife. I became a single parent. And so having a therapist that could really walk with me, not only through some of the physicality of like difficulty with sleeping, of brain fog, of challenges in making all these decisions by myself, using techniques and different modalities like EMDR to create some of those new neural pathways really shifted and got me to be able to manage my grief, where grief became a friend instead of an enemy. And that trauma that I was experiencing day in and day out, I was able to subside. I mean, there were some mornings I couldn't stop crying. I didn't want to get out of bed. I luckily had a 2-year-old that forced me to do that. Um, but going through and having a great therapist to provide that support and that trauma treatment really made a huge difference. And it's the thing I encourage my friends and the work I do with my clients. Grief is going to be with us always, but some of those initial effects of it, trauma treatment has really helped me walk through. I shared with Dr. Heidi, my mom passed really suddenly of a car accident about a year ago. And my third call was to my therapist to say, hey, can I get in for some EMDR because I'm having a really hard time. And it really helped change my life.
So Amanda, I know that now you actually do EMDR. I mean, you had this traumatic loss with your mom and you saw firsthand how it worked. How does it actually work? And is there any tips and tools that people can do now at home if they're not with an EMDR therapist?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of great research out there. I always say I'm not the best science-minded person, but it's a way that a brain heals itself. I always say when we have a traumatic experience, the world that was now safe is now unsafe. And that comes about in a lot of different ways, whether beliefs about ourselves, maybe experiencing a lot of anxiety, not wanting to leave the house. Maybe it's just that fatigue and depressed mood. I always say, like, I'm not a hypnotist. I don't erase memories, but what it does is to help put that memory in the right place. And it's super powerful. I always say it's really weird to explain to people, but it's such a unique process that really allows you to shift how you remember something. So for my mom in the car accident, instead of that phone call that I remember getting, I remember our last moments where she hugged me and said goodbye. So it shifts how I think about a memory and also the somatic part where I carry that trauma in my body. And for those, who have not experienced EMDR, definitely look into the good research, but I also think like just tips and techniques to do at home. It's just a lot of good self-compassion and nurturing. A lot of times the world tells us with grief and with trauma, we need to just get over it and move on. But I think it's offering ourselves a lot of self-compassion, doing things that are good for us, focusing on the things we have control over, sleep, diet, movement of body, trying to find connections. And those are the good kind of foundation that'll help us walk through grief and trauma in a really healthy way.
I like this. And I'm wondering, did the death of your husband prepare you in any way for the death of your mother? Or did you learn anything from his death that you carried with you when she died suddenly?
It's always funny. People would always ask, which is worse, a long drawn out death or like a sudden poof and you're gone. And so with my husband, it was 18 months of treatment, knowing that he had a terminal illness that was not going to be cured. That was beneficial. We got to say all the things, we got to take pictures, we got to create memories. It was hard because every day I was kind of wondering, is today the day? With my mom, I would have thought I was prepared, but man, grief of a parent is just a different thing. And the
Mhm.
way my grief presented was very different than when I lost my husband. I had kind of had some anticipatory grief. There's still some remnants, but when I lost my mom, I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't stop crying. I didn't want to leave my house, which was so different than when my husband passed. I was ready to make decisions and go. And so it was thankfully to a therapist helping understand just that different relationship, right? Of my mom was my like person in my life for 40 something years. And that sudden like poof and she's gone, traumatic loss was a very different loss than when I lost my husband.
Well, and
And
I'm
it,
also thinking here you were as a young widow, 30 years old without a husband. You probably turned a lot to your mother, almost
Yeah.
as a co-parent, as someone to bounce things off of, and really relied on her, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. My parents moved to our town that we live in to help me raise my son and while I went to grad school to be a therapist. So we had just gotten to like a place where life felt good. I was 10 years a widow. I felt like grief was my friend, my companion. And then all of a sudden, she was in a horrible car accident and was gone out of nowhere. So it really reshifted the alignment. And now my dad's a widower. And that's a whole different experience to be a therapist, a daughter, a widow, to try to help walk with him in his grief.
wow, yeah, a lot.
Hmm.
And you never know when things are going to come up to help you. I know that you just recently had quite an event from the Tunnel of Towers.
Yeah, we were incredibly blessed to have them pay off the mortgage for my home, even a decade after my husband had passed, which blows my mind in the sense of, my husband wasn't here. He didn't pick this house, but knowing that like his loss still provided such security for myself and my son that we don't have to worry about losing our home, that we have that. And my dad and my mom always wanted us to be a homeowner. And so it's just such a huge gift to know that my husband's life and his sacrifice still mattered 10 years ago, because you get 10 years into widowhood and people are like, "Oh, you're good. You're fine. You're not a widow anymore." But you always are. And so to have Tunnel to Towers recognize that and say, "Hey, your husband matters." And then to get to go to New York and to be part of the run and walk that they did where my husband was honored. It was incredible. And to have my son, who's now 12, experience that, to know his dad passing in the military meant something, is huge.
And Amanda, for those of out there that don't know about Tunnels to Towers, can you briefly tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's a great organization. They help not only Gold Star widows, but veterans as well. They help with homelessness, with housing, all sorts of different programs, and they're just incredible. I know them from the Gold Star side of many of my widow friends have also been blessed in this way. And it's just an incredible organization with an incredible story that I know you're familiar with.
There is a firefighter that was riding in his truck and saw that the trade center, was going up, and he got a call, and all the firefighters were running towards the trade center, and he was in bumper to bumper traffic. He pulled his truck over to the side of the road, put on all his gear, which is very heavy, it weighs 75 pounds, and ran to Manhattan through the tunnels up to the trade center, up the stairs, and was never seen or heard from again. He
Yeah,
sacrificed his
incredible.
life and to help other people. So I love the organization, and I love that they've given you this mortgage for your house. It's a
Absolutely.
Really fantastic. So I have a feeling your mother had a big smile on her face when you got your house.
Mhm.
She did, and we were lucky she was still living when we found out about that. She passed about 2 months later, so it was just a huge blessing that she also knew that we had security.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. If you had some advice for somebody who has just lost a loved one, what would it be?
You're not alone. It feels grief is very lonely and isolating because it's your relationship and your loss. And there are many of us out there in the world that have lost people that we love and want to connect with others. It might be a different experience, but we're out there. And I think it's about trying to find those connections and just being kind to yourself. For me, exercise, I would go and walk as much as I could. Even on days that I didn't want to do anything, it just helped me get out of bed. So doing just small practices, I think, are helpful during that time, and just giving yourself some self-compassion and grace. People love to say, the timeline of grief is just a year, and so I think it's knowing it's whatever you need. And also too, it's okay to reach out to a therapist to help support you in your grief journey. They can provide some guidance, a place to talk about your loved one when maybe your friends are tired of hearing about them. I still see my therapist 10, 11 years later to talk about my husband on death anniversaries or birthdays or days that are hard, because there's even more losses. Like, I turned older than he did. I am living longer than we were together and married. And, my son is 12. All these different things come up. So lots of support, compassion to yourself, and just healthy things, trying to eat well, exercise, move your body, get into some green and blue spaces, into nature near the beach. We moved that way just because I was like, well, if I have to move off a base, I want to be near water. And we ended up in the Emerald Coast.
How can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I'm currently licensed in the state of Florida. So if you're in Florida, I'd love the opportunity to talk with you or work with you. I offer telehealth as well as in person, and you can find me at my website at amandadoblercounselor.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today and for all that you do through TAPS and the work that you and Heidi do.
Amanda, thank you so much. You are such a great example of turning adversity and struggle into strength. And you're so positive. And I know it's not always been easy, and it isn't easy because you have had a lot of loss in your life. So thank you so much. And I'm glad that our paths crossed.
Yes, absolutely. It was such a pleasure meeting you at TAPS. We ran into each other several times, so I knew it was meant to be. And thank you for having me on this morning.
And Heidi and I want to thank everybody for joining us on our show today. And we always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.